Originally, I was going to leave it to just the Spider-Man film from 2002 for one of the movie rants and remaster, but I said, screw it! Actually, I'm going to rant about the other movies as well as later on down the line talk about Spider-Man Homecoming when I get to it. Spider-Man 2 is heavily regarded as one of the best films of the Spider-Man film franchise and one of the greatest superhero movie sequels of all time, if not greatest movie sequels, period. As a matter of fact, 2004 was a really splendid year with a lot of great movies. I mean, we went from Napoleon Dynamite, The Incredibles, Shrek 2, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, and several other films, especially Spider-Man 2. And even though we've had a couple of stinkers along the way like Shark Tale and Halle Berry's Catwoman movie, but Spider-Man 2 mostly took the cake for most people. You see, Spider-Man 2, of course, you can tell from the very beginning from when we saw trailers and all this kind of stuff, this movie really was actually the film that really was going to garner the hype, and the hype exceeded itself, and thus, after the hype died down, then everybody said, it's the best thing ever. As a matter of fact, it is the best movie ever, and the best Spider-Man movie, period. Hands down, one of the best film of the Raimi Trilogy. So, no matter how much people love the Raimi films, but Spider-Man 2 is the film that actually dominated the first movie's success. But even though when we get to the next movie, when I have a lot to say about that soon next time, Spider-Man 2 really, what I really liked about this movie was the fact that the stakes were higher and, considering the fact that they had to continue the story of Peter's journey of being Spider-Man, but this time around, his life takes a backseat from things. So, Spider-Man 2 was a very easy picking, just like the first movie, so let's go through the second movie while it's possible. Sam Raimi returns as director, the late Laura Ziskin, Avi Arad, Grant Curtis returns as producers. And speaking of which, I can tolerate the film having multiple writers for the screen story credit, while Alvin Sargent, the husband and screenwriter of late Laura Ziskin, wrote the screenplay all to himself. Even though Alvin Sargent was uncredited for doing any kind of props of screenwriting for the first Spider-Man. Now, we have like multiple writers, that was on board for the sequel. Alfred Goh, Miles Millar, and Michael Chabon, as those that were writing the story of what they wanted for the sequel, while Sargent did the screenplay. And of course, several others returning for, filmmaking crew like John Dykstra and Scott Stockdike for visual effects supervisors, and of course, Danny Elfman with the music score. But we'll get to those guys eventually. So, Spider-Man 2, you see, based on the high success of Spider-Man's $400 million opening weekend back in the summer of 2002, Sony opted a sequel to be for 2004 release, which originally was going to be July 2nd. Because if you think about it, today, July 2nd, 2017, at the time of this video's recording, Spider-Man 2, based on its original teaser trailer, link below, if you watch the teaser trailer and other, promo teaser posters that you can find on the internet, which is easily to be, accessed for, Spider-Man 2 was originally going to be released for July 2nd, 2004. I think that was kind of more like an international release date. I'm not quite sure. But Spider-Man 2 actually, later on down the road, since 2004 was coming near, they decided to slate the film for a June 30th release. And as a matter of fact, today, June 30th, at the time of the video's release, actually, is Spider-Man 2's 13th anniversary. We're 2 years away until Spider-Man 2 itself will turn 15, just like this year with the first movie, being 15 years old, and the overall film franchise. And you see, as 2014 came near, you see, 2004, I know that year will never come back ever again, but looking back on the year with all these movies, especially Spider-Man 2, I'll never forget all the time when Spider-Man 2 was happening and it was about to happen, and then after it came out, and then of course the video game, we'll talk about the video game after if I have any time for the retrospective remaster on the film. That all year 2004, 13 years ago, I was following Spider-Man 2 back, of course, I was like 11 going on 12 years old when Spider-Man 2 was out, and I was following the movie simultaneously especially looking at stuff up about the film on the internet, going to my local Toys R Us and Walmart stores, and for the first time going to my local Walmart where I live at, going to the Walmart toy section, finding some of the latest Spider-Man 2 toy action figures and whatnot, and other Spider-Man 2 themed merchandise, and as well as, of course, getting the Spider-Man 2 video game. And then it was just 2004 was just a maddening year for a lot of things, and hence that's why I've always liked it that year as a preteen going on teenager. And you see, Spider-Man 2 is just one of those films that will always hold in a special place in my heart in terms of Spider-Man films and superhero movies regardless, where it really captures the essence of how it feels when you have something holding on your shoulders and you can't, shrug off that weight, that, stressful weight anymore, until you have to give up on something that you can't really do at the same time when you got all these other responsibilities that you have to drudge right through in life. And that's what I like about this movie. And as a matter of fact, though, Spider-Man 2 is, of course, a continuation of Peter Parker's story of becoming the man he becomes to be. With great power comes great responsibilities, as quoted by his Uncle Ben. And what I really liked about this movie was that, surprisingly, it's mostly loosely based on two type of comics of Spider-Man from the golden age of comics, and Sam Raimi is a fan of the Amazing movies. The Amazing movie. Sorry, slip up right there. I meant the Amazing Spider-Man comics from Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's original run and whatnot. With the Amazing Spider-Man issue number 50 or 51, either way, with the iconic Spider-Man story, Spider-Man No More. One of the few iconic stories of the comic book character's history. And also, the comic is, of course, loosely based on Dr. Octopus's introduction into Spider-Man's lore, so good thing the movie adapted Doc Ock. Now, basically, when Spider-Man 2 was in its original development, speaking of which, the movie was originally going to be called, believe it or not, if you can put it this way, The Amazing Spider-Man, which eventually would also be the name of a reboot film in 2012, which came out 5 years ago at the time of this video's release and recording, and remaster, of course. But they decided to go with Spider-Man 2 because I don't think people were ready to call any of these movies The Amazing Spider-Man. But, I wish Sam Raimi was the return for Spider-Man movies and make Spider-Man 4 called The Amazing Spider-Man and start a new series, still have Tobey and them still around a little bit, or just not have them around at all, or whatever. But still. Now, originally, in terms of villains. Now, Dr. Octopus may have been excluded, and which I stupidly forgot to bring up in my original in my first video about the first film, about villains and what they wanted to choose for villains to be potentially happen in the 2002 movie. Now, Dr. Octopus was originally going to appear in the first Spider-Man film, and even, of course, one of the supporting characters who never got to turn into the Lizard in the Raimi films, never at all, Dr. Connors, as potential characters that will be around in the first movie. But actually, despite the too many characters thing, a lot of superhero movies tend to have that kind of flaw when it comes to developing a comic book adaptation of a particular superhero. It's hard to tell whether they wanted Doc Ock or the Green Goblin. But, the first movie went the Green Goblin, so this time Spider-Man 2 finally got the deserve and a chance to have Dr. Octopus. Now, there were no other. Now, in terms of Dr. Octopus's casting, there were hardly no other actors that wanted to audition for Doc Ock. Now, if you can recall from the pre-Spider-Man movie history, back when Spider-Man was trying to get its movie made, throughout all of the 90s and such, when James Cameron wanted to do his Spider-Man film in the 90s, I know I have to bring up James Cameron here again. Now, James Cameron originally wanted Arnold Schwarzenegger to play Dr. Octopus, but you know how that went. So, despite the fact Cameron and Schwarzenegger worked together on the two Terminator movies and True Lies. But unfortunately, here we are in the Sam Raimi verse of Spider-Man. Now, Alfred Molina, to be honest though, like all the other actors outside of Kirsten Dunst from Hollywood, you see, as I was growing up with these movies and stuff and all these superhero films and Hollywood movies and stuff, I don't really know much about these actors until I see more of their movies and stuff, and then I look them all up and become like totally obsessed with these actors. When really I shouldn't. Now, to be honest, though, I had never even heard of Alfred Molina until I heard that he was going to be in Spider-Man 2 as Doc Ock back in 2004, 13 years ago, when I was looking up stuff for Spider-Man 2, and especially one time when I got an issue of Disney Adventures in summer 2003, doing sneak peeks of some movies that would come out in the following next year at the time of, well, that book and stuff. And I found out that they were going to include Doc Ock in the sequel until I found out who's the new villain for the next Spider-Man movie. And I found out, of course, it was Dr. Octopus. Now, I am extremely, considering I was never a Spider-Man fan, like I said in the previous video, but growing up, sure, I've been aware of Dr. Octopus, but was I ever been a fan of him back when I wasn't into Spider-Man when I was a little kid? I don't really think so. But as soon as when Sam Raimi did Spider-Man and looking back on the animated series from the 90s and stuff, then all of a sudden, Dr. Octopus started, or Doc Ock, if you will, started to resonate me as a villain from Spider-Man's lore. Now, Doc Ock, I think, was a very brilliant choice for a villain for a sequel, which I thought would bring more levity and, weight to the movie in terms of character development, developing both Doc Ock and Peter's characters. So that's pretty much one of the greatest things about this film, and hence why Spider-Man 2 is lauded as one of the best films of the trilogy. Now, Alfred Molina in general, again, as an actor, I have never seen him in anything outside of Spider-Man, besides the fact after Spider-Man 2, I have heard him do a voice role in the movie Steamboy with Patrick Stewart and Anna Paquin. Coincidentally, two actors from Bryan Singer's X-Men films. The original trilogy, by the way, 2 of the 3 films, by the way, and a couple of other films afterwards, like The Sorcerer's Apprentice with Nicolas Cage, and as well as the Prince of Persia 2010 movie adaptation in 2010 as well. So Molina, well, I would say he is the best part in terms of out of all the villains Raimi adapted in his Spider-Man films. Doc Ock is actually more enjoyable than Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin or Thomas Hayden Church's Sandman and Spider-Man 3 combined together. So I really find it fascinating that Doc Ock is just really worth watching as a villain when it comes to the fact that he wanted to create a fusion reactor, that can, bring power to the entire city and all that and whatever. Because, I mean, the movie's easy to talk about. So let's go through the movie right away. Spider-Man 2 opens up immediately after after the first movie, 2 years after the first film. So we see Peter Parker struggling with his life, what's going on with his superhero life and his personal life. Movie starts off with them, looking at a billboard of Mary Jane, posing for, I think modeling, because from my speculation, I think Mary Jane was kind of modeling for some fragrance in New York, called Emma something something, but I just never caught on to that. I know I've saw Spider-Man 2 so many times during the 3-year hiatus before Spider-Man 3 happened and then years after and such. So Peter is seen delivering pizzas, and hence the whole Spider-Man being Spider Pizza Man all of a sudden. And of course, one of my favorite lines from from this movie, when he couldn't make it to deliver the pizzas on time when he was supposed to on one of the particular streets that his pizza shop boss, Mr. Aziz, told him to go within 8 minutes, because it doesn't make it by 8 minutes, it's too late. And that favorite line when he says, "Pizza time." That always puts a smile on my face a lot. But he of course doesn't deliver the pizzas on time, and then he up. Then he gets fired from his job. Then at the Daily Bugle, of course, J. Jonah Jameson is back, and better than ever, bad-mouthing Spider-Man and bad-mouthing Peter, saying he's fired. I mean, he said it twice in this movie, of course. And then everything is the first Daily Bugle scene of the film, I mean, everything's in deadlines and stuff. And if he doesn't deliver, and then also Peter tells Jameson that Spider-Man doesn't want pictures of him anymore, that Jameson had, turned the city against him. And Jameson's not very proud of it, so off and stuff like that. Then we cut to the the Columbia University college campus, which we had in the first Spider-Man film, but set 2 years after that field trip when Peter got bit by the spider. We're introduced to Dr. Connors, and Easter egg for those who didn't catch on watching all 3 of these movies. I'll give you an Easter egg spoiler, but for those who didn't, in the scene where Peter gets hit by some guy with a dark navy blue tuxedo hitting Peter with the backpack, that was actually director Sam Raimi from behind, but unseen with no face shown, because the camera was focusing on Peter getting hitting in the face hard with people's backpacks and purses. So Dr. Connors, of course, is also disappointed with Peter's inept failures of not keeping up in class, of course. So he's been laying back, because I understand Peter is trying to have a hard time trying to balance his powers and responsibility. Then, of course, we cut to Peter in his house, in which, of course, his Aunt May, since the fact that Ben Parker has been dead for only 2 years at the time of this film, she's threatened with foreclosure. But of course, they do have a chance to celebrate Peter's birthday. But at the time of this, when Spider-Man, I understand behind the scenes, Spider-Man 2, Tobey Maguire was near 28, 29 years old at the time when he did the second movie, though. So it's hard to tell whether how old Peter is in this continuity, so we don't really know. But whatever. My guess is that Peter in this film is still late 20s, the same age as the actor or something. But yeah, a Peter Parker who is around in his late 20s, still going to college. The hell? And then of course you have Mary Jane and Harry. First scene with them within 8 minutes of screen time, just into the movie later after the very 2-minute long opening credits and whatnot. So Harry, of course, in this film, the film focuses on Harry's rising character arc of his revenge against Spider-Man for killing his dad. Well, because considering the fact that what happened at the end of the first movie, Harry, after when Harry saw Spider-Man bring his father back, late in the dead of night, after what happened between the Goblin and Spider-Man's confrontation in the last movie, Harry wants to seek revenge against Spider-Man, and even, of course, spoilers, he wants to kill his best friend, who is also Spider-Man. But actually, what's the spoilers now? Everybody's seen this movie a lot of times, and everybody has already probably seen the Raimi Trilogy by now, but for those who have never seen these movies for the first time, I suggest, stop here, get the movie on DVD or something, or go to a friend's house, watch it, or all three of the movies in a marathon, and then come back to these movie rants and see what already happened. But for those who have never liked the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, or what's the point? And then, of course, several other struggles ensue. Then, Peter and MJ are strained from one another in this film as well. You see, Mary Jane is also in the beginning of her rising arc of wanting to be a Broadway actress, as implied and been established since the first movie. And I think, even though seeing the fact that Peter is behind with his dreams and stuff in life, Mary Jane is ahead of him. This will pretty much haunt Mary Jane next time when we get to the next movie, of course. But with Peter behind, of course, he made a promise during the backyard scene, which is the last time we'll have them in the backyard, in Peter's house, and it only happens in 2 of these movies now, where Peter and MJ talk about, her making it to Broadway, and MJ asks Peter to see her at her Broadway show, which inevitably, within minutes after, the scenes with his first apartment scene, and as well as the first scene with Otto Octavius and his fusion machine and meeting his wife, Rosie. And then the montage of scenes with Peter getting ready to go to Mary Jane's play, and etc. But she also mentions that she's seeing somebody else. You see, as much as I liked it, Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane in Spider-Man 1, you see, this is what I figured at, during my retrospective remaster on the second movie here. Like I said in the last video of the movie rants of the films, I liked Kirsten's Mary Jane in the first Spider-Man, but not here in the sequels. And you can tell this is where Mary Jane is more about her success of being an actress than about Peter or Spider-Man, or both. And, can't decide what boy she wants. So, Mary Jane is too picky in this version of Spider-Man. I wish maybe in the MCU movies with Tom Holland Spider-Man, if we ever get that Spider-Man Homecoming sequel, I hope they do Mary Jane justice and don't make the new MCU Mary Jane like Kirsten's Mary Jane in the Raimi films. I hope so. Then, of course, after Peter's, exchange with Mary Jane about the Broadway and blah, 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 then we cut to Peter with his apartment landlord, Mr. Dickovich, which, by the way, another Easter egg for anyone who's a longtime Spider-Man fan more than I am. Mr. Dickovich is basically, by the name, is based on Spider-Man's other co-creator, Steve Ditko, which is obvious. And then his illegitimate daughter, Ursula, who's only around for small minutes of screen time in the sequels, of course, and asks him for rent. Well, we don't have a great impression on Mr. Dickovich because, well, he's a dick through and through as a landlord, asking for rent. Yeah, robbing Peter for money, and after the $20 that his Aunt May gave him for his birthday, well, he needs to pay rent because he's late to pay rent. Otherwise, he'll end up getting evicted, and someone will take over his apartment room on because he's next door across Dickovich and family. So. And then we cut to Dr. Octopus. I mean, Otto Octavius before Doc Ock, sorry. And then, the introductions is great. Peter and Octavius, having their little pep talk while Harry introduced Octavius to Peter and Peter to Octavius. And then, of course, we have the introduction of Octavius' wife, Rosie, who is, I don't know if she's in the comics or not, but, hard to tell there. Donna Murphy, of course, playing, opposite Melina as his on-screen wife, of course. And then talking about his fusion machine making, have the power of the sun at the palm of his hands. That's the goal. But of course, later on, after we go through Peter's misfortune of going to MJ's play, and then his first power misfunction, then we cut to Octavius' demonstration. I know we're skipping right through. I don't want to spend too much time on this, ranting about the second movie anyway, like I did the first one. Then we get to the fusion demonstration, which is very brilliant. One of the best executed scenes out of the entire trilogy. Outside of, everything related to Spider-Man's origin in the first movie, Spider-Man 2 has some really well-layered, executed scenes to exemplify its story and the story that they want to tell based on the source material of Spider-Man's lore from the comics, based on what the film is based on in terms of the story arcs from the comics with Spider-Man No More, Octavius' first introduction, and as well as how he became Dr. Octopus and whatever. Now, as Octavius, fuses with his, mechanical arms, he uses them to, of course, test his, mechanical arms with his fusion reactor, and until some stuff backfires later on. His fusion machine goes cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs before you know it, and then destroys everything in sight and is trying to harm all people. And then eventually, once Spider-Man swings by and saves Harry, and then, Harry with the, as much as he's holding a grudge against him for killing his father. And then, of course, Octavius pushes Spider-Man away from trying to stop his machine, but Spider-Man is trying to save Octavius before the machine kills him as well, which unfortunately also led to the fate of his wife, Rosie, and then Rosie dies. Octavius, and then the blast from his fusion machine, eventually shocks him, which almost nearly could have killed him, but with the burning and the shock of the machine with the fusion, with his mechanical arms, it infused the mechanical arms. Once we get to the next scene in the hospital when Octavius wakes up, or actually, as a matter of fact, the tentacles wake up first, and we have some old school Sam Raimi fashion of filmmaking with very suspenseful, fast-paced filming and editing of the horrors of the mechanical arms that Octavius has, and kills all the surgeons in sight. Then, of course, Octavius wakes up and finds out he's merged with the arms and making him become a complete madman criminal. And he went from being a very innocent, fusion scientist to a madman with eight arms to try to destroy the world, and also find a way to rebuild his machine, and as well as, blaming Spider-Man and Peter for his, the fact of the backfiring of his machine. Then at the bank, of course, and during my rewatch, however, when I did the initial video about the movie rants of the trilogy in 2014, I didn't talk about, in terms of some scenes relating to Spider-Man 2, in terms of, like, let's say, some scenes before our first major action scene between Spider-Man and Doc Ock. The bank scene, with Peter and his Aunt May at a bank. And, you see, during my rewatch on the film, and back in my recent rewatches, lately, I kept thinking that the bank teller, when Peter and Aunt May was trying to refinance the mortgage so that way Aunt May wouldn't lose the house that Peter and his aunt had been living in, when Uncle Ben was alive. I kept thinking that the actor who plays that bank teller in that scene is the guy who would play Phil Coulson in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But I was wrong. It's not the same actor, not the same character, not the same guy. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies was long before the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But Spider-Man 3 in 2007 was 1 year before Iron Man came out in the rest of all of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so you gotta understand where I'm coming at with that. Then, of course, Octavius fights Spider-Man for the first time at the bank, and after their first encounter on ground, then Octavius snatches Peter's Aunt May, and seriously, Octavius, what's with your big deal with old ladies, really? What is up with that? You want to bone Peter's Aunt May, regardless if she's an 80-year-old old woman? The hell? And then, of course, you know, also, I forgot to mention that Spider-Man 2 has a great amount of great comedy here. We'll get to that eventually during the analysis portion. Spider-Man fights Octavius on the rooftops, and then Spider-Man saves Aunt May afterwards. Then the planetarium, Harry goes drunk. Peter tells Harry off about that he thinks that he's wrong, that but whatever, but Harry's like drunk as all hell, and you know how that is. And then of course, as soon as when they introduce John Jameson, and then next aside that, this is where Peter gets into more bad misfortune and bad luck here. He sees Mary Jane with the astronaut dude. And also, I would have liked it if the guy who played John Jameson in this movie should have played Eddie Brock in Spider-Man 3. Fuck you, Topher Grace! And then, of course, we, Mary Jane, despite the misfortunes and the disappointments of not appearing in her play, Mary Jane backs off Peter, well, twice, and in between that and the scene where they were walking around in Chinatown. And as soon as, next thing you know, Harry goes through a drunken rage, smacking Peter, and, actually just simply just bitch slapping him because, Harry is just, you see, Harry, this is what happens when you have too much to drink at night and then you bitch slap your best friend. All because you think Spider-Man killed your dad. As much as I love the Raimi movies, some of the things that they adapted in these movies with the whole Harry seeking his revenge for his father thing, it's just totally overplayed. And then, of course, we cut to the next scene where Spider-Man loses his powers again, frankly, and then as he tries to crawl and he probably shoots webs, and then he falls on his ass in sewer water. Ew. And of course he meets his physician about his narrow-sighted vision and other problems that he's probably diagnosed with. And Peter tells the physician that he was Spider-Man, that in his dream that he would crawl and shoot webs and save people and stuff like that. Like, don't we all wish we were all Spider-Man at this point? And then, of course, the physician told Peter that you're not supposed to be Spider-Man climbing on those walls. So, of course, we do cut to the very most powerful scene of the film in the second act midway through. Peter reflecting about Uncle Ben's words of great power and great responsibility, which he rejected this time around in the dream sequence, and tells, his uncle off in the dream, of course, that, no, Uncle Ben, I'm just Peter Parker. I'm Spider-Man. No more. In a tearful way, because it's a very powerful moment. And I love the way how they execute that Spider-Man No More storyline very well in this film. Now, after when I initially saw the film in theater, well, by the way, Spider-Man 2 was the only film of the Raimi films, and out of all the Spider-Man movies I've seen at this point, probably until when I see Spider-Man Homecoming sometime later this summer, it will probably be this was the only Spider-Man movie up until probably when I go see Homecoming that I've ever seen in theaters. The rest of the films I've seen on Blu-ray, DVD, and whatever, on TV and whatever. So, and seeing the Spider-Man 2 on the screen in theaters, I mean, out of all the Spider-Man films of the Raimi Trilogy, this was the only one I've experienced in the theater. And I really think it was a great experience. Seeing Spider-Man 2 in the theaters was a great way to make up for the fact I never got to see the first one when it was in theaters, or the third one. So, this was the only film I got to see in the theater, and kudos to my dad for taking me and my brother to go see the film during the summer of 2004. And boy, that was a splendid childhood memory, or late childhood memory, because I was going on as a teenager, of course. So Peter dumps his Spider-Man costume in the trash, and Spider-Man is no more. The rest of the arc, of course, is multiple scenes with the rest of the act of the film before we get to the climax is all about Peter doing random things he would have done normally if he wasn't Spider-Man. No web crawling, no saving people for a while, no swinging around cities, saving civilian girls or kids much. So He's not doing any of that for a while. So he's back to going to school. He's keeping up with his homework and blah, blah, blah. And then finally attends one of Mary Jane's play performances, but sadly couldn't do it first time around. And then, of course, Mary Jane and Peter, don't have a great pep talk as soon as Peter started, acting differently after he's no longer, he of course, spoilers, he reveals his identity of being Spider-Man later into the climax. Well, blah, 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 we'll get to that. And then after that, Mary Jane is not seen for a while for like the next 20 minutes of the damn movie. And then we cut straight to Octavius meeting up with Harry to get something for his fusion machine. The trinium, of course, by the way, for those who didn't, for those that remind me that I've forgotten about. And then, Harry vows to Octavius to kill Spider-Man and bring him to him so he can kill him. Then, of course, the scene with Peter, and also the scene where he has to save a little girl, an infant girl in the fire. Without a Spider-Man costume is kind of a dud. I mean, I liked the scene where he did a fire rescue scene in the first movie, but, as great as it was without the costume, but to me, this, for the second time in a row, I think it was pretty much of a disappointment to see Peter not wearing a Spider-Man costume for this. And of course, he saves the girl, but Peter's all burnt up and his face is all smoky as all hell. Then, of course, he sees Aunt May, and he sees his aunt packing up boxes because failure to pay rent. You know how I felt, May. You know how I felt in 2015. And of course, Peter wants to try to gain his powers back. That's one of the best moments of the film. The music from the main title's music from from Danny Elfman's score for the first Spider-Man appears here, but of course there is initial music. We'll talk about Danny Elfman's music later. But for the most part was when he was, running off the rooftops, and which is, of course, is one of the best scenes of the entire film, is when he was yelling, "I'm back! I'm back!" And then next thing you know, he falls down screaming to peril and busts his ass, and his glasses break, and he says, "My back!" One of the best moments ever. Then we see Mary Jane kissing the astronaut dude. Is it just me, or Mary Jane is a freaking skank? Then Mary Jane sees Peter again. I think it's been 20 minutes after they haven't seen each other for a while, and they were trying to reconcile what was going on with their lives recently. And eventually, as soon as Mary Jane tells Peter that does she love him or not, Peter stumbles to say something, and he says he doesn't, and then she convinces him to kiss her to prove that he loves her. But unfortunately, Octavius throws a car at them, and Octavius steals Mary Jane, and Peter, for some reason, as soon as when Peter sees Octavius, take Mary Jane from him, this is when his powers come back. So, and of course, we forgot Jameson. When the Garbage Man took the Spider-Man costume to Jameson thought Spider-Man must have given up, and he thought, solid victory. Victory 1 for the Daily Bugle crew, 0 for Spidey. But unfortunately, of course, in the next scene, of course, Jameson and the rest of the crew were at this point disappointed and depressed that Spider-Man is no longer in the city, while Octavius is on the verge of wanting to destroy the entire world with his rebuilt fusion reactor and whatever. But unfortunately, Jameson shows, fortunately, Jameson, as much as he still hates Spider-Man, he admits that Spider-Man was to still be around to save the city, even if there's that madman with the 8 arms on the loose. And then eventually, as soon as when he turns his back, he hears a whoosh, and then a swing from Spider-Man that Spider-Man would get his costume, and he's back. And then I like Jameson's, very famous freak out when he wanted Spider-Man prosecuted. And I want that web crawler prosecuted, and he's being strung by his web. And he was yelling, "I want Spider-Man!" Yeah, it's one of the best scenes ever in the whole movie. Then the clock tower scene, and the even more famous scene in the entire trilogy. Fight-wise, Spider-Man and Doc Ock on the train. Yeah, I like this train sequence, but I think this is one of the most overrated scenes in the entire trilogy. I like the sequence. I like the way how it was shot with the blend of practical filming and visual and CG effects and whatever. CG character models fighting on the train and all in the city and whatever. But it's really, really, really overrated. I get the pacing with the scene, but really. And Spider-Man is saving those people on the train and so forth. After Spider-Man saves those civilians on the train before it would fall to collision off the rails, the civilian saves Spider-Man from his fall, and Spider-Man falls into a concussion, falls into a pass-out concussion after using all his strength to use all his webs to stop the train from falling off the rail because it was about to go off track, and all the people are looking at Spider-Man unmasked to see who the guy is, when knowing nobody in New York even knows Peter Parker, but they know Spider-Man is, but now they know that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Great, buddy. Now you just revealed your identity. I understand you needed to take your mask off to save the people, but hey, in the Spider-Man 2 video game, mask still stays on, of course. Then, of course, Octavius takes Spider-Man, knock him out again, and then takes him to Harry's apartment so Harry can kill him and also make the deal. The deal was paid off. Octavius brings Spider-Man to Harry. Harry, Harry has to give Octavius the dream. Actually, Octavius pushes him away and take the dream for himself. And then Harry takes his chance to try to kill his best friend. Then, of course, he takes the mask off, and then Harry is shocked that his best friend is actually Spider-Man all along. Yes, this will eventually haunt him next movie. Then the climactic battle at Octavius's broken down warehouse on Bay, of course, with Mary Jane hostage. And seriously, what's with Mary Jane getting kidnapped in these movies? It just always bugged me throughout the Raimi trilogy. Then, of course, the final battle between Spider-Man and Doc Ock. Fight, save Mary Jane, fight some more, and then Mary Jane tries to knock Octavius' asses out with the part of his broken down apartment, but fails. Yeah, damsel distress she is. She ain't that strong enough. And then the fusion reaction, Spider-Man takes one of his webs to shock Octavius with one of the electrical cords and shock him back to his reinformed state before he became the madman he became before. And then, of course, Spider-Man tries to convince Octavius about his, machine that is about to destroy the entire world, along with New York within it. And then, of course, Peter takes his aunt's words about letting go of his dream, letting go of your dreams. And you have to be right to be steady and whatever. And you have to give up on the thing that you love the most. Because getting too carried away with the thing you love the most makes you become obsessed and psychotic in the head. So that's one thing. So Octavius takes Peter's word for it. He takes down his machine along with him. Peter takes Mary Jane with him, and thus that was the end of Octavius, and is of course his alternate home, replacing which mirrors to his original home that got destroyed by the machine, his original machine of the fusion reactor. And of course Octavius is dead. Ugh, great. Now there was a chance for a Sinister Six possibility happening in one of the movies of Raimi's. If only they should have never killed Octavius off. Great. MJ comes to a revelation that she finally realizes that Peter is actually Spider-Man. And of course, Peter tells Mary Jane that they can't be together like this, that Spider-Man will always have enemies, and he can't let it take that risk. But he also makes a vow that he'll always be Spider-Man, that both of them can never be together. And then, of course, he takes Mary Jane back to John Jameson. And then, of course, an even more powerful scene before the movie's over. Harry sees his father's ghost in the mirror, convincing Harry to take up revenge one more time to destroy Spider-Man, which of course sets up the next movie, of course. Then, as soon as when he throws the dagger after his father told him, "Avenge me!" Then Harry is shocked to see that his father had a behind layer, which was an underground layer of goblin tech, a glider, and the suit and everything, and pumpkin bombs, ready for arsenal. And then bam. So, setting up what we have in store. I would have liked it if Harry, for Spider-Man 3, donned his father's armor, but what do we get instead? You know what happens when we discuss the next movie later. Now, now the movie ends with Mary Jane going to a wedding. I was about to say funeral. Sorry for that slip up right there, almost during the recording process. And unfortunately, John Jameson, believe it or not, obviously and ironically, gets a Dear John letter. John Jameson, Dear John letter, makes sense. And yeah, that would be the last time we'll see that lame supporting character or minor character ever again in these films. But again, I would have liked it if they still had his actor around for Venom, but again, missed opportunity in the Raimi films in retrospect. And then, of course, Peter and MJ see each other with Peter, very amused to see Mary Jane in a wedding dress. Another missed opportunity for the next movie. They should have gotten married on the spot, right, either here or, in the beginning of the third movie. But nope, what happens afterwards? And then, of course, Peter and MJ kiss, Spider-Man swings off, and then the movie closes, fading off with Mary Jane looking out the window, saying what the yet will be yet to come with the greatest challenge in Spider-Man's life. Spider-Man 2 is absolutely a great movie. It's a very enjoyable film, of course, and despite the fact that actually, to be honest, though, no matter how much there was some downside to the film, now, to be honest, though, in retrospect, like the first movie, it can have some of its flaws, but its flaws can be forgiven, except the fact I've had a couple of nitpicks during the movie, during multiple amount of rewatches, as many times I've watched the sequel. One, the amount of celebrity cameos. What I've noticed during my multiple 13-year-long rewatch of Spider-Man 2 for so many freaking times, I've noticed how many times you're going to have so many celebrity cameos on and off every 20 minutes of the movie. I mean, we started off with Emily Deschanel of Bones, then we had Hal Sparks in the elevator scene when Spider-Man was talking about his outfit and stuff, and in the elevator and whatever. Then we have, of course, Phil Lamar during the train scene and several other celebrity cameos. And surprisingly, of course, Bruce Campbell does return for a cameo, of course. I mean, he was the wrestling announcer in the first movie. Spider-Man 2 has him as that smart-ass, snooty usher who doesn't want Peter going to Mary Jane's play, convincing to the fact that he should have made it when he was supposed to before the doors were closed. God, I love Bruce Campbell. Hail to the king, baby. And yeah, well, simple. I do think that the celebrity cameos, well, I guess it was kind of necessary to the fact that we needed it, but they should have cut down the amount of celebrity cameos, though, because it's not like, Spider-Man 2 is like a Saturday Night Live skit where multiple celebrities get to meet Spider-Man or something. It doesn't matter what celebrity. Hell, throw in celebrities like Dr. Phil or Shaquille or Shaq or Charlie Sheen or Kim or Paris Hilton at the time, because before there was Kim Kardashian, there was Paris Hilton. Or throw in other celebrities to be in Spider-Man 2 for crying out loud, and it's to see how many celebrities will be saying ooh and ah about Spider-Man and stuff like that. And yeah, it's coincidentally why we have so many celebrities, packed in cameo form for this movie, which I think levitates why Spider-Man 2 is kind of labeled as a superhero comedy, but it does have its moments of dark and serious drama, which I do mind with the great balance. Hence, that's why I love the Sam Raimi movies, for balancing what's lighthearted about Spider-Man and what's serious and dark about Spider-Man, which is pretty great. Even though, for the most part, the Raimi movies have always been whimsically, funny and comical, but still, faithful to the lore of the character by heart, since that's why we love Raimi's films. The second thing I also like to nitpick is the comedy. Yes, the comedy is what makes Spider-Man 2. Like Evil Dead 2, Spider-Man 2 has a great amount of comedy that you can laugh at, because there is a lot of great funny moments in the film that I can name, but aside from the elevator scene, what he said about him wearing the costume makes him itch, and getting riding up to his dick area, and as well as several other funny lines like pizza time, or whatever scenes that were funny, or the scene where he was yelling my back, and Jameson flicking out over Spider-Man's return, wanting him prosecuted scene. So yeah, you can tell exactly there was a lot of scenes that were so funny. And also during my rewatch, I've also noticed that as what I didn't catch on after watching the movie for so long, since the age of 12 and to beyond. As an adult, I've noticed in the beginning of the rooftop battle between Spider-Man and Doc Ock, one of the women civilians that come by the between the two windows. What's so funny, if you didn't catch on to this right now, if you were a kid watching these movies during the 2000s, or a teenager, depending on your age now compared to over a decade ago, what was so really funny about that scene, which is actually one of the most comical scenes of the whole fucking movie, is and not only that, Ock is a very sympathetic villain who, by the way, you should feel sorry for regardless of how much struggles he was going through, which led to his mad destruction and wanting to use that fusion machine to destroy the entire world. Sure, you can have your Heath Ledger Jokers or your Banes or Ra's al Ghuls or, I don't know, General Zod's or Lex Luthor's, but the villain of this movie has a doomsday machine that could have destroyed the entire world. You know, the lady, you know, comes up, you know, up to, you know, hearing rumbling into the walls of the building, and then as soon as when Octavius's tentacles pop out and bam, and then the next thing you know, she starts freaking out. And then, you know, what's really funny, though, it's kind of a sexual joke that Raimi kind of inserted, that I think when the lady civilian that I'm still talking about was freaking out over Octavius's tentacles popping out the walls, and when he was climbing up, you know, while still holding Peter's Aunt May hostage, that I think when he poked his tentacles, the parts of his tentacle out like sharp, you know, like sharp cones or something. I read it as a reference to the fact that I think Octavius wants that civilian, you know, in peril, that female civilian in peril, to suck his dick or something. And I think when she was freaking out, like, oh my god, mechanical penis! Mechanical penis! Yeah, she was probably freaking out like she probably never saw dicks before, but these are like robotic dicks. And then she's gonna freak out about it. And especially the scene where she freaks out, you know, looking at the camera, screaming her head off. It's so freaking funny. Or what about during the same scene, or what about during the pizza scene, and you know, when Spider-Man was about to deliver the pizzas, we do have the Scott Spiegel cameo. Yeah, Scott Spiegel was the co-writer for Evil Dead 2, and I think it was I still liked the scene where Spiegel wanted to take a slice of pizzas that Spider-Man was delivering, until Spider-Man would take the pizzas away from him, which is also funny too. Or what about during the cops and robbers scene that night when Spider-Man was, you know, when Peter was late to Mary Jane's play, but as Spider-Man, what was real funny about that scene was, I guess, would be that black lady saying, you know, when she was looking at, you know, I know this is what the Nostalgia Critic was, you know, pointing out during his top 11 dumbest Spider-Man moments video. I've watched that so many times that he was not lying about that, with the lady saying, it's a web. And then as soon as she sees Spider-Man swinging off, she's like, go, Spidey, go! Like, and also, I can't even tell based on her emotion looking like that. She looked like she was freaking possessed or something, or I don't get it. And I get the comedy in this movie. And as well as those two kids looking at Peter doing a backflip as soon as when the robbers were, you know, running over his, you know, moped. And then when Peter, you know, I've always liked the scene when Peter told the two boys to eat their green vegetables. And then the other boy was like, that's what my mama was always saying. I just never actually believed her. And during my commentary, when I was riffing on the movie so many times with the scene when Peter was smiling at the kid, he was like, yeah, right. Because, you know, no offense, but kids, eat your green vegetables. Or what about that scene, you know, one of the even more infamous comedy scenes in the entire film. The lady with the violin singing the Spider-Man theme song from the 1960s cartoon very badly. And I remember, nostalgia-wise, when I was a kid watching this for the first time in the theater, I was cracking my ass up seeing that scene with that lady, you know, playing the Spider-Man theme on the violin very badly. I mean, yeah, but in retrospect, I think it's kind of cringy and pretty phoned in. But other than that, though, the movie had great action, great development of the characters, and actually, I think the visual and special effects with the CG effects and stuff actually improved over what came before in the previous film. So kudos to Scott Stockdyke and as well as John Dykstra for the visual effects department of Sony ImageWorks once again, and as well as the animatronic works. And also, speaking of which, Spider-Man 2 is the only Spider-Man movie to ever win an Academy Award for anything, period, which is a shocking thing, really. I mean, a superhero movie that won an Academy Awards for Best Visual Effects? Are you serious? Well, of course, there's a featurette about that on the Spider-Man 2.1 Director's Cut, of course, DVD. Also, speaking of which, I actually was watching the movie, looking back on it more and more on the 2.1 Director's Cut. So, actually, I think Spider-Man 2.1 is a better version of Spider-Man 2 than the original cut we saw in theaters like back in the summer of 13 years ago. Actually, as a matter of fact, I think Spider-Man 2.1 is better than the regular Spider-Man 2 cut. So, therefore, I say the extended version is much more better. But we'll discuss something like that similar when I get to the next movie in terms of its newly released editor's cut. Now, as for Danny Elfman's music for Spider-Man 2. Elfman, okay, here's the thing, guys. Now, looking back on Spider-Man 2 and some of the music that Elfman did for the sequel, you see, I hate to break it to you, but some of the music that Elfman, did, reprising the same themes of Spider-Man from the previous film and whatever, I just think that Elfman's music for Spider-Man 2 was not good. And also, you can tell from the start of his, reprisal of the main title's music for the first movie, to the sequel, which is the signature theme for the Raimi movies overall. I think his new version of the Spider-Man 2 main title's music, and especially for Spider-Man in general, wasn't really all that great. I think in the beginning, after the Columbia Marvel logo, if, link on that below in the comment, somewhere, that in my opinion, I think it's weaker than the first movie's way of doing that music. It just feels pretty weak. I do like his overture of the Doc Ock theme, after that, but other than that, it's pretty weak. And then there was a lot of rejected music that he had intended to appear in the film. Thus, no wonder Elfman described his experience with Raimi miserable for the score for Spider-Man 2, hence why Christopher Young was replaced with Elfman in the next movie for the score. And not only that, for the train sequence and as well as Doc Ock's demonstration sequence, in terms of the score, again, Raimi wanted Elfman to do the music for those scenes like off of something that Christopher Young did for the Hellraiser movies. And surprisingly, something I never caught on to until I saw Hellraisers recently in these, later years recently, that, for someone who's never been a fan of the Hellraiser movies or most of the first two, I never caught on to the music vibe of, the music for the scenes with Octavius's machine demonstration scene. And I read it as the fact that it's paying homage to Hellraiser, and I get it's probably due to copyright at some point. But again, considering Spider-Man is no Hellraiser, but I get why they did it. And of course, but more and more frustrations between Elfman and Raimi ensued, and thus, as soon as when scoring completed or nearly completed, Elfman was like, he was getting very infuriated with Raimi's decisions on the score for the sequel, and thus that's why Elfman walked off from the score, and Christopher Young took over a little bit. Hence, that's why Young took over for the next movie again. So other than that, Spider-Man 2 had some good, musical scores by Elfman once again, but most of the music, if you listen to a lot of the unused music, you can tell exactly why most of that music barely or never at all made it into the final movie. Now, some of the rejected music from Spider-Man 2 made it into Spider-Man 3, so it's either here or there as well. Spider-Man 2, of course, if the movie was extremely awesome, it also spawned an even more awesome video game adaptation, thus also proving that video games based on movies shouldn't suck. So, as a matter of fact, Spider-Man 2 is that one superhero movie game that did not suck, period. Spider-Man 2 still to this day, video game wise, is still the best Spider-Man game I have ever played. One of the best games ever. You get to swing around New York, you do all kinds of GTA style things with Spider-Man, like, saving civilians off of, falling buildings, and as well as boats and whatever, but that expands upon in later installments, of course. Of course, it follows the movie's plot and blah blah blah, and centrically about Spider-Man's comic book world, with characters like Shocker and Black Cat and other characters, Mysterio, appearing in the game as well. Also, the PC game of Spider-Man 2 sucks. Don't even bother playing it in retrospect. Don't even bother. I heard it's terrible. So, with a awesome and solid sequel to the Raimi Trilogy, this is where the Spider-Man film franchise, as I theorized after 10 years later after this retrospective, is where everything really starts to fall apart. So come back this Christmas when I discuss a lot to discuss about Raimi's final installment of the Spider-Man film franchise, of his era of films. And even though everything should have been great in Moss, everything had great high stakes, great character development as time was coming along, but everything come the next movie will take a step backwards, and I think there's a lot of things that needs to be said about that. A pity, though, the next movie doesn't have any of that kind of stuff compared to this movie or the previous one, as we enter the sort of semi-worst installment of the Raimi trilogy, which is the final installment of the trilogy. Things begin to shake up much for better or worse when we get to the next installment of the trilogy. And of course, the epic suicidal downfall of the Sam Raimi films of Spider-Man. Spider-Man 3.